All right, happy Friday, everybody. Does anybody, I just want to offer it, but does anybody have any questions or feel comfortable asking any questions, clarifications about the scapula um, before we move on to the shoulder? Obviously, once we're done with all the joints we have left, shoulder, elbow, radial ulna, wrist, um, then we can go back and do a lot of full body examiners, okay? But if anybody needs anything clarified, always feel free to ask. All right, here was the plan so far. We started at the ankle and subtalar. We worked ourselves up, and now we're coming back down to the periphery, okay? So some of these motions will have similarities. Just like the cervical had similarities to the trunk. Not exactly, but the scapula is a version of the pelvis, obviously very different because they're independent of each other. But now we're going to start to get to some real similarities with shoulder, hip, elbow, knee. I'm going to explain how the radial ulnar joint is very unique to our dexterosity in our fingers. And then our wrist is a version of our ankle and subtalar. Okay. So let's talk about first what the shoulder has similar to the hip. Um, they are the same classification of joint. They're both ball and sockets. Obviously, there are different joints. One's called the shoulder, one's called the hip. And the big difference is that what we gain in hip stability by having a big socket acetabulum, you guys learned it. There's an extra thick ligament in there, these big, powerful leg muscles that cross that'll aid in our motion, but also aid in stability. We put a lot of inventory in making sure we don't do this to our hip, because if we do, we are in trouble. Maybe not now, because I have a cell phone and I can call medical, but our ancestors, if you dislocated your hip, it was a really, really bad day. Shoulder dislocation, it's not great, but I can still run away from danger. I can still move around. But if you dislocate your hip, that's a problem. So the shoulder, this would be the hip, and I'm going to show you how the shoulder is a different type of ball and socket. Because we need more mobility in our shoulder, we can do more stuff up here than we do down there. We have to make some trade-offs. One of the trade-offs is, instead of a big, thick, deep socket, we have a very shallow socket, almost like a golf tee. A golf tee, y'all know what I'm talking about? A little golf tee where the golf ball sits on? That's a socket. It's not big. It's just enough to hold it in place, but not enough to get in the way of when you hit the ball. It's going to go far, right? So our shoulder socket is very shallow. In addition, we don't have extra ligaments like the teres ligament that's in our hip. We try to supply stability. Yeah, there are some ligaments there, but we try to supply stability, extra stability with muscles. That's what you've heard of, the rotator cuff muscles. And again, that trade-off is so that we can do movement up here that the hips just don't allow, because we put more inventory in stability down. Right? However, motion-wise, they follow the same rules. There's some illusions, but they follow the same rules. Ab, add, flexion, extension, external, internal. I think the one of the biggest illusions is that when the hip flexes, it's kind of coming to your center of mass, like coming to your belly button. But when the shoulder flexes, it's going away from your belly button, right? So, and also, I think I mentioned it several weeks ago, ESPN has been lying to you for years about what full extension means. Maybe at the elbow, right? You're fully extended at the elbow. But this is shoulder flexion because it's going to help get you into fetal position. You're not going to get into fetal position like this. You're going to get into fetal position, this. Shoulder flexion, okay? But it follows the same rules. Left shoulder, left hip flexion, extension, add, external, internal. It even follows the same rules about horizontal. Horizontal add, blah, 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 horizontal add, da, 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 da. Okay? the thing that I wanted to emphasize today is because of that extra motion that we have in our shoulder, we do have to do a little bit of combinational motions in the frontal plane. And that's going to be the essence of this. This is what you're going to learn new today that maybe you haven't had before. So Trusty Kendall, the MVP of class, very versatile. Ken is representing my humerus. His body. So if you think about it, here's the left humerus. You see how they have this trochleus, these little condyles, that's going to be his feet. So like, in other words, this is where the elbow joint articulates. Okay. This is his head. Notice he's looking to his right because all of the humerus is kind of looking to the right relative to the front of the bone. We're good? Okay. So watch this. Watch the problem that we kind of have. If we take Ken, this is the socket, shallow golf tee socket. They call it the glenoid fossa. But it's the socket of your shoulder joint on your scapula. If we flex, we get to this point, right? Remember how I said the shoulder doesn't go all the way, right? Some of that stuff is the scapular lead, okay? What I also like about Ken is his face represents the articulating surface. You know, remember that term hyaline cartilage, right? That's the hyaline cartilage is the part of the bone that we want. It's smoothed out. It's there's synovial fluid there. It's the part that's designed to move about the other part to reduce friction. The smooth part, right? We don't want this part articulating with the socket. This is where muscles insert and there's bony prominence. If we want the smooth part. The ball doesn't create an entire globe. It's just literally kind of half of a planet right here. That's the articulating surface with the shoulder. I'm going somewhere with this. I just want to make sure we understand that we want to keep smooth on smooth. So far, so good. So what I like about the Ken doll too is his face represents the smooth part of the humerus that we want to keep articulating with the smooth part of the socket. We don't want Ken's top or back of his head to articulate because that's not smooth. Just like on the neck, I'm sorry, on the greater and lesser tubercles of the humerus. So watch this. When we flex the shoulder, we stay smooth on smooth. We do this, no problem. No problem. I think from this example too, because this scapula can't go anywhere because it's bolted down, right? You can see how we literally can't, without moving the scapula, like we got a bone right there, right? The collarbone is right there. So really our only option is to kind of do this about 160 degrees and then the scapula leans the rest of the way against over it. Smooth on smooth. Now, if we did lateral flexion, let me explain the problem. If we went abduction or lateral flexion, we would do this. If we did that only, whoa, that doesn't look like it works. So what we have to do, it's really neat. We want articulating surface on articulating surface. So what our shoulder does is it abducts until we run out of smooth on smooth, until we run out of road, and then something magical happens. We externally rotate our shoulder. Now, it's not as abrupt. It kind of happens gradually. Just like you turn a curve, You're gradually going less and less and less north and maybe more and more and more east. It's a gradual process. But check this out. If you externally rotated your shoulder only, wouldn't your hand, if you're in this position, elbow flex, wouldn't your hand go from being at the bottom to the top? You're repositioned. Very similar. When you get here, by externally rotating, you're bringing the bottom of the smooth surface to the top, and then you can go further. And you get to the same place as you started when you just moved in the sagittal plane. Let me show you with Ken. This gets you to the same place as this. Abduction, external rotation gets you to the same place as this. Because we can't do this. That makes sense? Okay? So let's do a little experiment. You don't even have to stand up. Let's use our arms. Okay? What I'd like for you to do is start with your arms on your side. And I really would love for you to have your bicep facing in. So in other words, you could internally rotate just to really emphasize that your biceps are looking at each other. Okay? From there, I want you to raise your arms over your head. Okay, like this. Clap on the top. Okay. Now, your brain is like, whoa, my biceps are still facing in. They're not. Hold this position, and without rotating, bring it down slowly. And you tell me, are your biceps facing in or out? Aha! It's really weird, huh? But the reason they're now facing out is because you literally had to externally rotate as you brought your arms over your head. If you stayed internally rotated, you can't do it. You have to be able to clear Ken's head so that you could continue up to get to the same position you would be sagittal. Make sense? There was you know how they talk about snake oil salesmen? Like it's a cliche of people that are trying to sell you things, you know, maybe back in the day before we had Twitter X and we could, you know, grok it. One time I was at a conference and this guy was trying to sell. Now I think they got sued. It was like these holograms, you know, like the holograms create a force field, some kind of crazy stuff. But I was young and dumb and I was looking for a fight. And I'm like, tell me more. This is very interesting. And so the guy did a test on me where my friends were on one side and he purposefully put me in front of my friends and he hid my shoulder from them. I mean, I'm analyzing, like I did it because I wanted to see what trick. And he purposefully internally rotated my shoulder. And he said, let's check your range of motion at your shoulder. And he went to abduct me. And obviously I couldn't go up any higher because I was bone on bone. My shoulder's not going to do this yet. So I could only go up until I ran out of articulating surface. He didn't allow me to externally rotate, to reposition my socket, to bring the bottom part, which has road, to the top part so that I could continue the journey. I knew this. So he's look at how little abduction he has. And then he took out his little, you know, ray gun or did his little hologram thing. And then when he wanted me to have motion, he externally rotated me and brought my arm. And he was like, isn't that cool? I was like, yes. Let's talk. Your shoulder has to externally rotate as we go out to the side in order to clear our humeral head, to bring our hands over our head. It's subtle. We don't notice it, but it has to happen. Let's do one more example, because this is a, and Lindsay, correct me if I'm wrong, this is a really weird kind of concept. That's not normal, but life is not normal. Human movement is not normal. There's no rule that says this stuff has to be easy. That's why you guys are going to school for it, to learn cool new things that aren't easy. Let's do another practice if you are so inclined. We're going to do the traditional upright row, because that's going to be definitely definitely be a test question. And what I want you to notice, and you could do this if you want, I think it always helps to move and see it. I'm going to take a pin, and I'm going to notice that my biceps are looking at each other. So in other words, we start position. I'm not anatomical, definitely not externally rotated, somewhat internally rotated, right? When I bring the bar up to my chest, to my chin, my shoulders are going to externally rotate. And the way I know this is because if I'm trying to bring the bar to my chin, I need to bring my hands up. What better way to bring my hand up than to do this? Hand up. It's subtle, it's gradual, but let's look for the clues. Start, biceps are facing in, finish. My shoulder has nothing to do with the pin. My shoulder has nothing to do with my elbows. My shoulder rotation has nothing to do with the frontal plane. So if I bring my shoulders back, notice how my biceps are now facing the front of the pelvis. I went from here to there. And the only way that can happen is with external rotation. It's subtle, but it has to happen. In fact, I think you can see it right about here. See it?
So kind of never like use past your elbow.
You don't, but you don't even need your hand to go past your elbow. You don't have to have it because and this is when we get into the radial ulnar joint. Your radial ulnar joint is working with your shoulders to keep your fingers under the bar. So in other words, as your shoulder is trying to externally rotate you, your radial ulnar joint, see what they, yeah. So those two things are working together. If you didn't have the radial ulnar joint, you'd be here. And if you didn't have the shoulder, you couldn't get up higher than this. You have to externally rotate. Now, again, I'm not saying it's like this. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's subtle. It's a subtle rotation that's going to allow, it's going to allow you to bring your hands up. That's why, like, sometimes when you're coaching it, right, you may say, keep those elbows up, right? The elbows up is where you can have the shoulder get a little bit of extra with rotation. And again, these things are hard to notice, they're hard to see, so that's why we use clues. Well, where did you start, where did you finish? But I would say, and Lindsay, again, check me on this, one of the hardest references of global and local is, again, my biceps are facing in, so I'm internally rotating. But when I'm up here, your instinct is to want to say, well, I'm still internally rotating, but you're not. If I externally rotate my shoulders, we all agree? Externally rotate. If I externally rotated my shoulders and then I abducted, that's like saying, why would it be any different than if I just flexed my shoulder? My palm goes from looking forward to looking back. It just flips. So it's the same concept. Here's my spoon. It's going from facing laterally to facing medially. The same concept. So we don't want to use things like, well, why wouldn't it be internal? Because the biceps are facing in just like they were facing in down there. It's like, well, because that's not how it works. Bring it back to anatomical because that's a reference for us. That's why we want to bring it back to anatomical. Does that make sense? Good question. Good question. So again, it's subtle. It's not obvious, but it's subtle, but it's there. And my job is just to introduce you to the fact that in the frontal plane, check out this analogy. This may work for you. If obviously y'all are familiar with merry-go-rounds, love merry-go-round analogies. So if I was on a merry-go-round, and let's say the merry-go-round represented one of my planes. I'm on this side of the merry-go-round, and the merry-go-round spins. And if you notice, I have some general motion here. I'm literally going from one end to the other end, going out, coming in. But then I'm also rotating as I do it, because when I get to this side of the merry-go-round, I'm facing the other way. So there had to be some translation into it. All I'm trying to tell you is that to get from here to there would be the same as going from here and here. So if the merry-go-round, I know it's not the same plane, but if the merry-go-round represented my sagittal, if I cut across, I have to rotate to get to the same place. Make sense? Okay. So I think that's the key, is that when we go frontal, we have to have this external rotation in order to get to the same place. That's it. I'm not asking you to know how much. Grad school. I'm not asking you to know, well, the shoulder gets about 30 degrees and then the scapula starts to elevate and then the external rotation starts at grad school. All I'm asking you to know is that when I bring my arms up, and remember, I'm never going to ask you a question like, what's this? There's always going to be significant motion. So all I'm asking you to know is when I bring my arms up, whether it's sagittal or frontal, my scapula is going to have to lean, my scapula is going to have to reposition to help get me there. And if I specifically go frontal, I have to have some external rotation so that I can get to the same position as I would have sagittal. Make sense? Any questions? Lindsay, can you think of some other, maybe some traditional illusions, right? Like we don't want to use midline, like that kind of stuff. So some other shoulder illusions that we can't necessarily do with our hips because our hips don't go as much as our shoulders, right? They don't move as much as our shoulders. But we definitely don't want to use this mythical midline rule for shoulder. Don't want to do it. Okay? We want to use fetal, getting in the fetal sagittally, getting in the fetal frontally. That's why they have the term lateral flexion, just say abduction. So let me give you an example of what I'm trying to preach to you. If we say shoulder abduction is movement of the arms away from the midline, that's all fine and dandy for the first 90 degrees. Ab, 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 ab. But what about this? Aren't they both going back towards the midline? But that's not the same motion. Or what happens here? That's towards the midline, but this is obviously not the same as this. Okay? So we don't want to use towards or away from a midline because that's a global reference. Because on the test, I'm going to do something like this, and you can be like, oh, bilateral shoulder adduction. What? If I was in a mirror and I did this, would my other shoulder do that? They would do the same thing. Okay? So it's the same concept we did with the hip. We did with the claw, or rotations that are trying to get you into fetal, whether it's sagittal or frontal. It's still trying to do the same thing. It's still spinning the same way. Example, where's my trusty clock? If you know what it's not, to me, I love process of elimination. If you know what it's not, it better helps to make clear what it is. There is zero world where we would say, this is clockwise and this is counterclockwise. You see what I'm getting at? There's zero world where we'd say, well, away is clockwise and then towards is counterclockwise. We would never do that. Because you would be basically saying this would be the same as this because it came back to the middle. No, it's the same rotation. So if we say that this is it's the same spin. There's a mirror effect. So my right shoulder is going clockwise. If I looked in the mirror, my left shoulder would also be going clockwise in the mirror. Make sense? But this is the same motion the whole way. It has nothing to do about coming in or going out. It's about how is it spinning. Does that make sense? Okay? So right shoulder flexion, right shoulder extension, extension from, flexion to, flexion from, extension to. That was first test. This test is the lateral flexion, the ab from and the ad to. And then we have the internal and external rotation, internal, external. Shoulder is, let's see if I can think of a way to explain this. I think a lot of people miss the hip stuff because of shoulder. True or false? Let's say we separate this pool noodle, I think that's what it's called, into top and bottom half. When I rotate it, the entire segment is rotating the same, rotationally, right? Let's do clockwise rotation. However, linearly, remember general motion is a combination of rotation and translation. This side is going up while this side is going down. This side is going to your right while this side is going to your left. But they're all rotating the same way. Yes or no? Follow me here. Our knee flexes in anatomic position posteriorly, bottom of the pool noodle. Our elbow in anatomical flexes anteriorly, top of the pool noodle. So when I have the same rotations, the rotations are the exact same. But sometimes students say, well, if I have internal rotation on my shoulder, my hand comes in. And then they'll say, oh, well, if I have internal rotation on my hip, my foot must come in. And it's like, no. When I have the same rotations, my hand comes in, my foot goes out. My hand goes out, my foot comes in. That's the same rotation. Does that make sense? So I think the shoulder rotation, just because you memorize the shoulder rotation, you can't utilize the same linear clues. Which is again why we don't do global references. We don't want to use landmarks and say when that does this or when this does that. We can use local landmarks relative to each other, no problem. But we don't want to use hand comes in, foot goes out. I don't want to use those kind of things. Does that make sense? Why? I can totally see how some people want to say this is internal rotation. Because this is internal rotation of the shoulder. But they are not the same rotations at the shoulder and the hips. Does that make sense? Because that would be like saying this is the same rotation at the full move. See the difference between this and this? I think that's a big illusion. That this is right shoulder ab. Whoa, this is something that's on video forever. Ab, also add, blah, 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 blah. Add, da, 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 also add, da, 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 da. And if you say, well, how do you determine like, you know, adduction from, abduction to, well, that's why we have angles. That's why we do goniometry, right? So you could be like 90 degrees of abduction, 100 degrees of abduction, 120. Just as a reminder though, and this is what's going to play in therapy, personal training. One of the biggest lessons that I think I can give to you, that I can give to you, you're paying for this, so you're earning, is when you're doing range of motion, when you're analyzing someone's movements, it's to teach you that it's not globally referenced, it's locally referenced. What I mean by that is if someone's trying to do a range of motion and they're compensating, you need to be able to see that they're compensating and not say, oh, it looks like you have all of your motion here. Because they may be leaning something or they may be cheating somewhere. And we need to be able to see where these things are happening. I'll give you an example. It was on the first test. Someone's doing curls and they're standing up and they're like doing this. I know you guys are going, oh my gosh, they're cheating. They're using other body parts to make it look like the weight is just going up and down, right? I know that's super obvious, but maybe here's a less obvious. If you're doing, Lindsay, would you mind being my assistant? Oh, goodness gracious, Ron. Really need to stop with the Irish coffees. All right, let's go prone. Okay. Flex left knee. Okay. So one of the things that we would test in hip range of motion, internal, external. Remember the illusion, right? I'm not following the foot. I'm literally seeing how the hip. If Lindsay's tight on her hips, she's going to cheat by rotating her pelvis. You feel your pelvis rotating? So if I know that her hip range of motion should be 45 degrees, but I'm using her lower leg reference to the room, I may not see her pelvis cheating, and I might say, oh, normal hip range of motion. Thank you. Does that make sense? That's what I'm trying to get us to see, that we don't want to just use like, oh, bone relative to the room, because that's when you get, that's when you get some, that's when we make mistakes. We all do. Okay. So shoulder range of motion is kind of relative and absolute. In other words, in the clinic, you may say, bring your shoulders over your head, and it's probably better to do it bilaterally because at least any kind of cheating will cancel itself out. What I mean by that is if all you do is the right, they're more in line to maybe bend to the left. If you do the left, maybe they're more in line to cheat to the right. But if you do them together, does that make sense? So again, globally, you may say 180 degrees of shoulder motion. Layman's terms, I have no problem. But you guys need to know that not all of that motion came from the literal glenohumeral joint, right? You get about 120 from the shoulder joint, and the other is literally the scapula repositioning itself. That's important. Has anybody ever heard of a term called frozen shoulder before? It's where there's a shoulder injury and there's so much scar tissue that it freezes the shoulder. Well, someone could still technically abduct their arm about 60 degrees. Guess where that's coming from? This is the scapula. Those are the things I just want to present to you, to introduce to you, so that you could utilize it later on and help some people out because of it. What's going to make you excellent clinicians is not reading from a cookbook. It's being an artist in what you do. I give you an example. How many of you have friends or relatives? Usually they're older, they could be younger, that are just wizards in a kitchen, right? They really could. A lot of those people don't necessarily follow a cookbook, right? They just know. You taste it and you're like, oh, it needs some of this or it needs some of that. You go off a feel. And it's okay to start your journey with a cookbook. You're going to have rehab plans. But every hand that you're dealt is going to be different. It's the same game. You're playing the same game, but every hand is different. Every round is different. And the more you play, the more you pattern recognize, you see consistencies, and you see differences. That's what's going to make you next level. Okay? So that's why when Lindsay and I are encouraging you guys to move, especially during the test, because that may help you to see some of these illusions, right? Like the shoulder, for example. You know, I may give you this one on the test, and you're like, okay, Campbell said there was something weird about it. I promise you, nobody's going to, there's a judge-free zone. That's right. Like, I just want you to feel comfortable doing some of these movements, because I don't know about you, but unless I see it or do it, it's harder for me, or I don't say it's harder, it's easier for me to assume and fall into these illusions. Because the human body has a lot of illusions. And it's because our instinct is to want to make everything global. Our instinct is to want to make every reference, ceiling, floor, sides, front, back, left, right. That's the kind of talk we've had our whole lives. But kinesiology is within, it's locally referenced, so we got to use those. So, all right, enough preaching. It's not sunbaking. How about we do a full review? In other words, we'll start from the ankle, and we're not going to go into so much illusions, but if you want to record, if you want to take pictures, I just want to reiterate, I almost said regurgitate, reiterate what we've covered and what you're responsible for, okay? Let us review. What can the ankle do? Plantar and dorsal, right? Can the ankle invert and evert? No, that's the subtalar, that's the wobble. Ankle subtalar is like a skateboard. The wheel is the ankle, and the balance or the wobble is the subtalar and transverse tarsal joints. Not important for my 80-year-old father, important for us. Make sense? Ankle plantar and dorsal. Why does the ankle have two different flexions? That doesn't seem fair. Well, the ankle is kind of unique and different, but we have two different ways we can get in the fetal. We can get in the fetal with our feet on the ground. That's dorsiflexion. And we can get in the fetal with our feet off the ground. It's plantar flexion. That's why. That's why the ankle doesn't have extension. There's two different ways to get in the fetal if you're weight bearing or not. Subtalar joint inversion and eversion. Going medial, going lateral. Okay, so that's the wobble. When you're balancing, it's your subtalar joint, helping you skateboard balance. Okay? All right, our knees. The easy one, flexion and extension in the fetal, away from fetal. But if you also remember, when our knee is unlocked, our knee is flexed, we can have internal and external rotation of our knees. Specifically, this helps us when we're doing torsion, when we're cutting and planning, because if we didn't have that rotation, we'd rip our knees out every time. 60% of the time, it happens every time. Okay. Medial and lateral, cool, or external and internal. Those are synonymous. Hips, sagittal, flexion, extension. Frontal, ab and ad. Transverse, external, internal. Pelvic girdle because of hips. Right lateral because of right hip ab, left hip ab. Left lateral because of left hip ab, right hip ab. Anterior because of bilateral hip flexion. Posterior because of bilateral hip extension. Right transverse because of right hip internal, left hip external. Left transverse because of left hip internal, right hip external. Cool. Trunk, literally like a tree can sway. Flexion gets me in the fetal, extension gets me away. Flexion from, extension to, extension from, flexion to. Right lateral bending of my tree, left lateral bending of my tree. Right transverse trunk rotation, left transverse trunk rotation. Landmarks, sternum and pubis. If they're lined up, I'm not twisted. If my sternum is deviated to my right hip, I have to be twisted to the right, regardless of if I do this or this. It's the same twist. Right transverse trunk, left transverse trunk. Notice the difference. When I just rotate my pelvis, you don't see my shirt crinkle up. But when I do this, you do. That's how you know. The clues are in the clothing. We can have pelvic girdle rotation because of the trunk, if you remember, right? So in other words, if I was off the ground and I did left transverse pelvic, it would be because of right transverse trunk, cap and bottle effect. Right transverse pelvic because of left transverse trunk. Oh gosh. Fuck. All right, I'm just warning you. The way God, the stuff I do for education, it's be so embarrassed. The way my low back contours, it creates suction on the table. You're gonna hear probably some very embarrassing sounds. It's from me, but it's not what you think. All right, who cares? Check this out. Posterior, because of trunk flexion. Anterior, because of trunk extension. You see my back arcing, right? That'd be like extension. Posterior, because of trunk flexion. That violet shaking, out of shape. Anterior, posterior. Anterior because of extension, posterior because of flexion. Some of you in the clinic, you're going to do posterior tilts. That's literally using your trunk muscles, which I'll teach you in biomechanics, using those flexors. You're flexing the trunk when you do this. It's subtle, but it's there. Does that make sense? Moving up the chain, we did cervical. Cervical flexion, chin to chest. Cervical extension, chin away from chest. Right lateral cervical bending, right ear, right shoulder. Left lateral, left ear, left shoulder. Now again, illusions. If I move my right ear to my right shoulder, I get to the same place if I move my right shoulder to my right ear. It's the same motion. It's the same bend. Is the same as. And you're like, when would you ever do that? Well, if you're stretching this way, you may bend your head back and keep your eyes level, right? Yeah. Landmarks. Chin, sternum, transversely, good reference. If they're lined up, I'm not rotated, I'm not twisted. If my chin is more on my right shoulder, I'm twisted to my right. Right transverse cervically rotated. So that can look like this, but it could also look like this. It gets to the same place. Same as, and if it helps you, Lindsay, I don't know if this worked for you. But if you freeze it and say, man, when he moves non-traditionally, it's hard for me. That's okay, that's natural. But you can always go back home traditionally. So this is what I mean. When Campbell moves the board about the player, and you're like, all right, that's weird. The board moved back, but I think it's fine. Just say, where am I at now? And how would I have to go back traditionally? And you can prove how you had to move. Meaning, if I do this, and you say, all right, that's untraditional. But if I say, how would I have to go back to where I started traditionally? Wouldn't I have to rotate to the right to go back to where I started? So that proves that I had to rotate to the left when I left. That makes sense? And finally, we have our scapula. Remember, the purpose of the scapula is to help. Scapula is just trying to literally help get our hands a little higher, a little lower, a little bit more in front, a little bit more in the back, by orbiting our rib cage. If all I did was flex my shoulders, I'd feel like a T-Rex. It's all scapula contribution, helping me reach a little bit more further, reach a little bit more back, help get my clock hand at 12 o'clock globally. Scapular elevation, depression, protraction, retraction, and then upward and downward rotation. Remember, the pelvis, it has no choice to move together. Scapula, my left is independent than my right. Yes, it is. It's an analytical question. Thought question. You know that when I have right lateral pelvic girdle rotation, you see how my left pelvis kind of went up relative to my right? Did this. And you also know that my left hip had adduction, right? Adduction. So imagine my pelvis. It's really fun. Imagine if my pelvis just became my left scapula. And now my left scapula would have the same rotation. What I'm asking you to see is if I did some type of shrug or some type of elevation, it might look like my shoulders stayed in the same position globally. But can you see how it would be very similar to my hip? How as I do this, my shoulder actually adducted. Because if my shoulder stayed in the same position as my scapula does this, my shoulder would do this. That makes sense? That's kind of neat. So I kind of have some adduction when I elevate, just like I have adduction when I laterally rotate. That's kind of cool. Any questions? Was this review helpful? Remember, in the shoulder, we have the same rules of the horizontal. Horizontal, 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 I'll give you one more. I know we have 1 minute, but I'll give you one more to think about. I'll answer it on Monday. Pelvic girdle question. Pelvic girdle to hip. Because so many people are like, we need more. We need more questions. Start, finish. Start, finish. Start, finish. Have a good weekend.